Maybe get started. Welcome everyone to our AI/ML talk series. Today it's my great pleasure to introduce Joe Marino to you, who is a PhD candidate in the Computation and Neuroscience program at Caltech, advised by Yisung Yu. So Joe focuses on improving probabilistic models and inference techniques using neuroscience-inspired ideas within the areas of generative modeling and reinforcement learning. And let me actually also add to that a personal note that Joe has been a long-term collaborator of mine at the group, and most recently we've published together in compression, so he has got a lot of different interests. And yeah, so I'm very excited to hear you speak, and with that, I'll just hand it over to you.
Thanks, Stefan, and thanks everyone for coming. So this is a talk about connecting some ideas that I've been working on in machine learning back to their origins in theoretical neuroscience. And so hence the title of the talk. And if you're interested in kind of diving into these ideas a bit further, there's a paper I posted on arXiv here, which explores them in more detail. So in this new era of deep learning, we're often confronted by these types of graphics where people try to mash together things like the brain and these computational graphs or deep learning networks. And you got to wonder, what is the relationship between deep learning or machine learning more broadly and neuroscience? And so that's what we're going to try to explore in this talk. And so in the first section of the talk, I'm going to go through some background just about neuroscience and the origins of some ideas in theoretical neuroscience. And then we're going to look into this area of theoretical neuroscience called predictive coding. And then we're going to explore the complementary area in machine learning which often goes by this name variational autoencoders, although there's other families or other models within that family. And then we're going to combine those two together and see that by tying these two areas together, we get some kind of weird correspondences between neuroscience on the one hand and machine learning and deep learning on the other hand, which could provoke some new inquiries into connecting these areas. So when we look at these biological neurons, the trend has been to abstract these into these really simple computational elements consisting of weights, summation, and nonlinearity and output. And this is generally referred to as like a linear threshold unit. And the origins of this go back to this 1943 paper by McCulloch and Pitts called Logical Calculus for Nervous Activity. So here's Walter Pitts and Warren McCulloch. And they had this idea that we're going to abstract away biological neurons into these abstract computational units. And if you went and asked these two gentlemen what area they worked on, you'd probably get the answer cybernetics. What's cybernetics, you might ask? Cybernetics was this idea that developed in the late 1940s that was kind of developed by Norbert Wiener. And in this book, he went on to define information. So he actually was a mentor and a teacher to Claude Shannon. He had a really strong focus on probabilistic models, formulated these models using variational optimization, and used this to define techniques for control and perception with some connections to neuroscience. So this is kind of the origin of thinking about machine learning and computation and the brain at the same time. And if there's one thing you should take away from cybernetics, it's this basic circuit, which is called a comparator circuit. And the idea is that you have some input, some desired kind of signal that you'd like to have, and you take the output, you compare it with a prediction, you get what's the error between my prediction and my input, you take that error, and now you update your estimate in some way. And so this is this basic circuit that is performing what's called negative feedback. So the idea here is that you're going to use errors in order to correct your estimates. And this idea is ubiquitous. So you find this in Kalman filtering, so on like the more perceptual side, and then you also find it on the control side in the linear quadratic regulator and like PID control and those types of feedback control techniques. And this goes back to, negative feedback was known before the 40s, but Norbert Wiener really was the person to compare that with the functioning of neural circuits. And so you're probably familiar with that idea if you work in machine learning, because that's also the basis of training artificial neural networks. So if you have an artificial neural network here, represented by this kind of rectangular shape, you feed in some data and you output a prediction. And now you compare that with some target, you calculate the error in some way, and then you use that error to feed back into the network to update your weights. So that's negative feedback in the backpropagation algorithm. And so you might be asking, like, it kind of makes intuitive sense, but why would we use the error? Why would we use the error? So it turns out that the error is generally the gradient of the log probability of exponential family. So let's break down what that actually means. So I'm going to take a Gaussian density, and now let's just assume we have a mean, and we just have a unit variance on this Gaussian density. So we have this curve here, which is representing this Gaussian, defined over some variable y. And so I can write out the log probability of that density in this form, where you have the squared difference between your mean and the value of y multiplied by 1/2, and then you have some constant terms, which we won't get into. And so the thing is, when you want to update your mean estimate, if you take the gradient of this with respect to the mean, well, now the 2 comes down, you cancel that out, and now you're just left with the error. So that error right there is really telling you that if you want to improve your predictions, you need to evaluate and reduce these errors. So if you want to follow this gradient and improve your predictions, you have to reduce errors. And so what can we say about neuroscience? Well, actually, neurons are not these abstract computational units. Neurons are actually quite complex and extremely diverse. And they're arranged in these intricate circuits. So we might not just be able to say one biological neuron is one computational abstract linear threshold unit and be done with it. We might have to dig a little deeper. And so when we look at the actual processing within the brain, we see this really complex circuitry going on. And I'll walk you through the visual pathway, which is arguably the best understood pathway within the brain. And the idea is that you have, early on in this visual pathway, you have this retina, which is taking in these photons through photoreceptors. You have some normalization that's going on through these bipolar and horizontal cells, and that's passed to these retinal ganglion cells, which is then piped up to the rest of the brain. And you enter this region called the thalamus, where you have these relay cells, which are being contacted by these interneurons, and you have these top-down signals coming in, bottom-up signals coming out, and that's being fed up to what's called the cortex, neocortex, cerebral cortex, which consists of this kind of basic circuit that's repeated over this 6-layered structure. So we have a lot of complexity going on here. And so we're going to have to try to figure out a way to make sense of all of this. So that's what we're going to hopefully try to get at through this talk. So when we look at the neocortex, this is the brain area that's really involved in all higher level sensory motor processing. So if we could figure out what's going on here, that would be a big step toward being able to solve a lot of these sensory perception and control kinds of problems. And the basic structure consists of this layered structure, as I alluded to before, with different neurons appearing at different layers. You have columns within the neocortex, where all the neurons within a column are communicating with each other and performing different functions. You also find that across the cortex, you have this hierarchical structure where areas are arranged kind of in this, one area sends top-down signals to a lower area, which sends bottom-up signals back up to that area. And then within a particular brain area and cortex, you have this lateral inhibition that's going on. So you have different columns that are talking to each other and inhibiting each other and kind of forming these kind of relationships in some way. So what can we glean from this? Well, this kind of says that there's a basic circuit motif here. So there's a basic circuit in cortex. It consists of these forward and backward connections, and there's some type of normalization going on here. So there's something maybe that we can abstract out computationally about what's going on. And the surprising thing that you might actually not know is that actually the top-down connections outnumber the bottom-up connections. So if you're used to thinking about sensory processing as this, well, first you feed in the pixels, and then you get some higher level abstraction, and then more abstraction, this bottom-up fashion. It actually seems like the brain is not just doing that. There's more to the story than just that simple bottom-up picture. So this brings us to predictive coding, which is this theory that really goes back to cybernetics, but was more developed in the early and mid and late 1990s. And so the idea here can be traced back in some form to this paper from David Mumford, in which you consider a cortex which has these higher areas and lower areas. And he abstracted this out to say, okay, we have these higher areas and lower areas in cortex, which have this layered structure, and each area is communicating down to the thalamus, which we said was kind of the second stop in this pathway. And so you can look at, this is the neuron view, and so we've abstracted it out to this diagram over here. And his basic idea, his premise was that, what if the thalamus, this region down here, plays the role of something like an active blackboard? And so what he meant by that is that we're going to try to form our best reconstruction of some aspect of the world on the thalamus. We're going to reconstruct, or in a sense, predict what's going to happen in the sensory input. So you can think of this as we have these reconstructions or predictions that are coming down the hierarchy or coming down the thalamus. And then what's passing up the hierarchy is something like an error signal, which is saying, you didn't predict this or you didn't reconstruct this properly, and you need to update your latent internal estimate of what's going on. So this is a generative view of processing in neuroscience, which is different than this kind of typical bottom-up view that we typically get. And even though at the time that was really just a speculative theory, there is quite a bit of evidence now to support that theory. So going back to this paper from 1999 by Rao and Ballard, so this was kind of the paper that really broke the lid off of it, where you had what's called this end-stopping effect, where if you have this small bar, you get a lot of these kind of signals that are coming on, but if you get a larger bar, you get a suppression of those signals. And so even though the response profile for this neuron doesn't include anything outside of this receptive field, if you have things that are outside of that receptive field, you can get a top-down kind of effect where you silence what's going on. And you can possibly think of this as something like silencing a prediction error. So you wouldn't normally expect to see a small bar, but if you see a larger bar, that can suppress any errors that would arise in just seeing this small bar that appears. So you can also see similar things in auditory processing, where if you have sequences and you replay the same sequence over and over and over again, and then you have a sequence which has some deviant tone, that you see a larger response into that deviant tone. So there's some kind of novelty that's being detected there, some kind of error in some way. And you see a similar thing with image sequences that are being presented. So it does seem in some way that cortex is forming some type of prediction and sensing when there's a violation of those predictions. And then finally, there's this recent paper just put on bioRxiv, where they show that there are specific top-down predictions that are being targeted to specific layers within the neocortex. So this is even getting to a finer grain detail of kind of at the circuitry level what's going on here. So there is a lot of evidence to suggest that this predictive view of cortex is really potentially more in line with the data than this purely bottom-up view of sensory processing. So the way that we can think about formalizing this, and this goes back to this paper from Rao and Ballard, is as a probabilistic modeling and inference process, very similar to what you might think of as a Kalman filter. So the idea is that we're going to have a latent variable z, which is going to generate in our model this observed variable x. And so this is what's typically described as a latent variable model with this explicit density form. So you have this joint density over some observations x and a latent variable z, and that consists of this conditional likelihood, the probability of x given z, and then a prior over z. So you have some state of the world, z, and you're predicting, using your conditional likelihood, what is the current observation that would be implied by that state of the world, and then you can evaluate what is the probability of all of these things? So the way I like to think of it is in the following way. I like to break out those variables into their densities in this computation graph kind of formalism. So the idea is that that white circle is going to represent a prior. So it's the same prior we had before. And now this blue dot here is going to represent our estimate now of the state of the world. We're going to have an updated estimate of the state of the world, Z, given our observation X. And then through some model parameters theta, we're going to generate a prediction or reconstruction of our input. And that's going to give us our conditional likelihood, this green dot, P of X given Z. And then finally, we have our data X. So X is this coming from the data distribution. It's coming from the world. It's the distribution of photons on your retina, distribution of pressure waves against your cochlea. This is the data that's out in the world. And now in these models, typically we assume that this conditional likelihood is a Gaussian distribution. So this is just a modeling assumption we're going to make. And in particular, so there's a Gaussian distribution over X with some mean mu X, which is a function of Z. And then we're going to have some diagonal, so some independent covariances here over the dimensions of X. And then we're going to also assume that the prior is a Gaussian distribution, which with some mean variance. And then finally, just for simplicity, for the sake of getting through this example, we're going to just consider Q of X as a delta distribution. So it's just a point estimate of the maximum a posteriori, or just the most probable estimate of Z, the state of the world. And so the whole idea here is that if we want to update our estimates, so we want to update our estimate of the state of the world, Z hat here, what we need is to optimize some objective function, which we're going to call L, which is just a variational objective. And I won't unpack that too much for the sake of this talk, but definitely check out the manuscript. So we're going to optimize this objective L with respect to this blue dot, Q of Z even X, which is just in our example here, a point estimate. And I've kind of written it out in terms of these red dots, and we're going to unpack that right now. So if we want to update our estimate of the state of the world, Z hat, that involves potentially making some gradient updates to that estimate. And in the case of this model that we outlined, those gradient updates just involve a linear combination of error terms, which I've denoted down below. So what are these errors? So this xi z is the error between z hat and our prior. So this is the log likelihood, log probability of our estimate of the world under our prior estimate of how the world should be. So this is just subtracting mu z and z hat, and then weighting by sigma z. And then we're going to use that to update our estimate. And then likewise, we have this error over here, which is the error of the mean of our data prediction with the actual data that's observed. So this is like your data level error that's coming in. And then you're also weighting that by mu x. And then importantly, because there's this mapping between our latent state of the world and x, we have to invert this mapping, and that's what this J is over here. This is the Jacobian matrix of this mapping. So I'm not going to unpack what that means exactly in this talk, but just think of it as like some way of inverting our prediction errors down here in the data space back up into the latent space. So we just need to do that inversion on the data prediction errors. So if we take this combination of error terms here, now we can update our state of the world and hopefully arrive at a more accurate estimate of what's under there, or what's out there under our model. And so in this example that we walked through, where we saw we could use prediction errors, we were using these diagonal distributions throughout. So you might be saying, well, maybe that's not a very reasonable assumption. So we had these diagonal variances out here. So you can think of that as just you only have the diagonal components of a larger covariance matrix. So in 2D, you could think of this as having two variables, so just two dimensions of this, and you're independently sampling those dimensions. So if you had a Gaussian distribution like this, you can think of it as like this axis-aligned Gaussian distribution, where you have some variance in the Z2 direction, you have some variance in the Z1 direction, but they don't really get to talk to each other. In contrast, we could have a full covariance Gaussian, potentially. So this would have a full covariance matrix here, where we have more than just the diagonal terms. And now you can think of this as having some communication between the two dimensions here. So, and what that really amounts to is being able to rotate this Gaussian distribution. So we have linearly dependent sampling that's going on, being mediated through this covariance matrix. And that can be performed using this kind of lateral inhibition, where first you sample Z, and then you use that to determine what you sample for Z1, and then first you sample Z1, then you use that to determine what you sample for Z2, and or vice versa. And so now that we have all these different aspects in place, we've kind of alluded to some of the aspects from biology. Let's flesh this out in a little bit more detail. So we have this basic circuit that we saw before. And so the basic idea is that each column within Cortex would be computing one kind of latent variable, and you'd have these errors that are being calculated at each area of Cortex. You'd have some latent estimate that's being calculated at each column of Cortex, and then you also have these predictions in each column. And now you have prediction errors that are being fed up, so fed up from thalamus, fed up from lower areas to higher areas, and then likewise you have predictions that are descending down to thalamus, predictions that are descending from higher areas to lower areas to give you these prediction errors. And so in a little bit more detail, I wouldn't say that the biology has been totally linked up with the models, but roughly you can think of the distributions and the errors as representing some type of firing rate of the principal neurons, these pyramidal neurons within Cortex. The model weights, so these top-down prediction weights are denoting some type of descending pyramidal neuron synapse. So this is like the top-down synapses. The inference Jacobian that we needed in order to update our estimates would be the ascending, so bottom-up pyramidal neuron synapse weights. And finally, as we discussed, the lateral inhibition that's going on would be implementing something like a covariance matrix. So giving you dependent sampling, just kind of improving the types of distributions that you can represent within your model. So that's a rough correspondence. And there are some papers that have gone to a little bit more detail in trying to link this up with the cortical circuit. But I won't get into that here. So in this third part of the talk, we're going to be discussing a kind of sister area of predictive coding, but now in machine learning. And this, in modern terms, this is generally referred to as variational autoencoders, although the more general term is deep latent variable models. So what's a deep latent variable model? So these are combining deep neural networks with these types of latent variable models. And the canonical example is this model called the Helmholtz machine. So this goes back to 1995. And the kind of difference from predictive coding is that we're also, instead of using that Jacobian kind of updating strategy, we're going to learn a separate inference model. We're going to learn a separate set of weights in the bottom-up direction. So we're performing inference in this direction with the set of weights phi here, and we're performing prediction with the set of weights theta. So it's very similar, at least at first glance, to the predictive coding scheme that we saw, except that now it has more of this kind of autoencoder interpretation where we're taking our data, encoding it with our inference model, and then decoding with theta, our generative model. So this is referred to, at least in modern terms, as amortized inference. And amortization really just means spreading out costs. And so you can think of this as we're spreading out the costs of inference by learning a separate inference model. You can think of this as like meta learning, but applied to inference, or really just learning to infer. So instead of performing this gradient-based updating that we discussed for predictive coding, we're going to be just learning an encoder that directly maps us from our data to our estimated state of the world. So this is an encoder over here, and then the generative model now plays this role of a decoder. And the benefit of this is that it's substantially more efficient. So instead of having to perform many, many update steps for reconciling the errors that we have, We just have a one-shot encoding process, and then we decode as well as we can. So just to walk you in a little bit more detail through these variational autoencoders, so the idea is we're going to combine a deep latent variable model with variational inference, so this kind of updating scheme, and then we're going to have this encoder. And in order to backprop into the encoder, get gradients for our encoder parameters, we're going to reparameterize the sampling. It's just a way of getting gradients through a sampling process. So the idea, if we string out that graph that we had before, is that we have this encoder network, phi. We have this sampling computation graph, which is just allowing us to backpropagate through sampling. And then we have this decoder neural network theta over here. So we have now this autoencoder with this probabilistic kind of interpretation. And so things are great. And you can string out these models into even hierarchies of variables. So there's been some recent work in showing how you can scale up these models, where you have these inference models that extend out over multiple levels of variables. You have these predictions that now extend out over multiple levels of variables. And fairly recently, people have shown that you can actually train these models to generate fairly realistic image samples here of 256 by 256 images. So all these faces are totally generated by the model. They're all new faces. And it's kind of cool because you can now take these models and interrogate them and see that if you keep all of the variables, all of your estimates of all the variables, you retain all the detail in the sampling process. But if you now restrict just to the higher levels of the hierarchy, you kind of abstract away and you just end up with kind of the rough details of this person's face. So you do find that you get increasingly abstract features as you move up the hierarchy, which you also observe in Cortex. But there is one issue with these types of models, which is what's called the amortization gap. So what is that? So it says that if you take the distribution that you're trying to estimate, and you really look at what is the optimization surface. So instead of just assuming that we're going to output a one-shot estimate of this latent distribution, if you actually observe how could we improve our latent estimate, you see that there's some gap between this one-shot estimate, which is this blue diamond here, this turquoise diamond, and this red star, which is the optimal latent estimate that you could have. So there's some gap there, and if you were just to perform more of the predictive coding type of iterative updating, which is this gradient descent curve here, you could actually get a bit better of an estimate. And in practice, this does translate into a gap in performance. So you're not inferring these latent estimates as well as you could. So in my work, I've looked at trying to now reconcile variational autoencoders with more of the predictive coding style of inference procedure, where we're going to still learn the inference procedure, still have this meta optimization interpretation, but now make that an iterative procedure to hopefully increase the accuracy and expressivity. So the idea is that we're going to encode these inference gradients or those errors that we saw before. So instead of having this direct type of procedure, we're now going to have this iterative procedure, which is maybe closer to predictive coding. And in a couple of papers, I've shown that this is more accurate than these direct encoder models and is also more general. So you can extend this out to different types of models that you wouldn't naively be able to apply this direct encoding scheme to. And finally, in this section, I want to also touch on that aspect of getting beyond these diagonal distributions that we had before. So in the deep learning community, probabilistic modeling community, there's been this recent development of what's called normalizing flows. And the basic premise is, again, that we're going to try to add or remove some type of dependencies. So you can think of this as if we had two independent variables from the standard Gaussian distribution, we apply some forward transform and get two dependent variables now, which have this much more complicated distributional form. And if we enforce that this mapping is invertible, now we could take two dependent variables and map them to the inverse mapping and get back a standard Gaussian distribution. So it's this nice way of parameterizing either adding or removing dependencies between variables, which you can think of as this general form of normalization, which literally means converting something into a normal distribution. And so you can think of this in relation now to that covariance matrix scheme that we saw before. So that covariance matrix is really just giving you linear dependencies between your variables. So you can think of it as having a standard Gaussian distribution, which you then apply some rotation and shifting and scaling to. And now you could get this full covariance Gaussian distribution, where the dimensions of z tilde here are now linearly dependent. But with a normalizing flow, with a general normalizing flow, you could take this same Gaussian distribution and map it to some arbitrary, more complex density, potentially, where you have nonlinear dependencies and other types of complicated forms beyond just this full covariance Gaussian, and you can map it back to this standard Gaussian distribution. So that's kind of this relation between covariance matrices, as we saw before, and normalizing flows, which really is just a generalization of that same idea. And even though I've really been discussing this generally in the context of kind of over different dimensions of space, you could also apply it across time. So if we think of having some graph defined over time steps, you could take variables at each time step and now try to remove the dependencies from the next time step's input. So you can think of this as taking the past three inputs, forming your best mean and standard deviation predictions, and then applying this invertible mapping to get out a new variable which has removed a lot of the redundancy in just the spatial appearance or temporal aspects of this scene that's coming in. And in a paper last year, we showed that this results in improved performance and generalization of these types of models. So this is also quite related to the predictive coding models that we saw before, but now applied across time. So now going into this last section of the talk, I wanted to talk about what can we draw from seeing these connections between variational autoencoders and predictive coding, and what does that imply about biology and the deep networks that we're training. So we have this same kind of basic computation graph that if we apply the assumptions of predictive coding, we can get over to neuroscience. And if we apply some of the assumptions of VAEs, we can get over to machine learning and deep learning. And I see this as kind of this nice bridge between neuroscience and machine learning, which has some new correspondences that wouldn't intuitively be obvious just from trying to compare deep learning and neuroscience naively. So if we go back to this view of the visual pathway, where we have retina, we have this area of thalamus, and we have cortex. With this new interpretation, I'm just kind of giving you the broad overview. We can think of retina now as really just computationally performing this spatiotemporal normalization procedure. So taking in some input and converting it to some output that has less dependencies between the different dimensions across space and across time. Likewise, thalamus is also potentially performing this type of normalization procedure, but now mostly just across time, and also providing the basis for where we're going to calculate our errors at the lowest level. And finally, when we get up to cortex, we can think of this now as this type of prediction machine that's calculating these top-down predictions, calculating the errors at each level, and then using those errors to update estimates using this inference procedure. So you can also visualize it in this way, where we have the computation graph strung out now over time, where at this bottom level, we have some normalization procedure that's going on. So that's just the inverse of a normalizing flow at the bottom of this. And that's going to correspond to where retina is in this computational process. And now when we get up to the higher level where the bottom level errors are being calculated, this is where thalamus is located in this computation graph. And then finally, as you move up this hierarchy in cortex of the graph, that's where cortex is operating. It's just a hierarchy of latent variables that is constructing this model of the world in which you're predicting down at this lowest level, but also at each level of the hierarchy potentially. So we have this nice cake that we've built here. So what can we say now about the correspondences between these areas? So if we look at just the top-down predictive component of this, in the predictive coding interpretation, we can think of these top-down connections as being mediated by pyramidal neurons generally. So you have these excitatory pyramidal neurons that are parameterizing that top-down mapping. But when you look at variational autoencoders, it's actually a deep network that's parameterizing that mapping. So here we have this kind of weird correspondence where we have these pyramidal neurons in one case, but now deep networks in another case. And it's a similar story when we look now at the inference side of this computation graph, where it's also thought that you'd have pyramidal neurons mediating this bottom-up inference procedure, where you're incorporating these errors to update your estimates. But then also now when we look at variational autoencoders, we again see there's a deep network in place of where those pyramidal neurons were. And so this is showing more of this iterative amortized inference procedure. So it's kind of this striking correspondence that you wouldn't initially assume. And then if you take that correspondence and now think about what that implies about backpropagation, this mythical training procedure that we've been looking for in the brain, it says that we shouldn't be looking for backpropagation across the entire network. And there's actually this idea that's kind of been independently developed somewhat in both machine learning and in neuroscience. And it goes by various names, but one name is this idea of target propagation. And the idea is that if you have these top-down predictions, that provides these local errors, which could provide a local training signal. And so the nice thing about these predictive coding models is that all of the errors are local. You don't have to do this backpropagation procedure across the entire network because all of the training happens at local modules. So if you look now at the variational autoencoder kind of view of this, you're only backpropagating within the networks. You're not backpropagating across variables. So you're only backpropagating here from this error back into this network, and then you're done. Whereas now that would imply that you would only, if you were going to find backpropagation in the brain, you would only really expect to find it within neurons. It's only happening locally at these neurons. And it remains to be seen how well this can be described, but there are some papers that have looked at both formalizing pyramidal neurons as computationally analogous to deep networks, as well as performing backpropagation within the dendrites of those neurons. So I think there is some evidence to start to go on there, but it's really early days for looking at this. And now, so that was the pyramidal neuron side of this. Now let's go over to the normalization and interneuron side of this. So as we've been discussing, these interneurons could potentially add or remove those spatiotemporal dependencies between those pyramidal neurons. So again, we had both the normalization side of this and the unnormalization side of this, where we can either remove dependencies or add dependencies using these local interactions. And so what does this say about each of these areas that we discussed? So you can think of retina as performing some type of spatial normalization. And there are models in the retinal literature going back quite a ways that have said that this seems to be computationally what retina is doing, where you have these local filters, which look like these center surround filters, which are just extracting any changes in the visual scene. So is there any edges, any things like that? And this computationally is what I've shown here is ZCA whitening, which is just a linear form of normalization. So you can think of this as just inverting a linear affine normalizing flow. So there's spatial normalization going on here. And when we get up to thalamus, there's some papers from the mid-90s they're talking about how thalamus could be performing some type of temporal normalization. So at the level of thalamus, you can think of this as another normalizing flow, but again, in the normalizing direction, where we're removing those temporal dependencies. So that's computationally just inverting another normalizing flow here, but now across time. And then finally, when we get up to cortex, you can think of those cortical interneurons as giving you either adding or removing spatiotemporal dependencies between different cortical columns. So we have these different cortical columns here, and you could either try to remove the dependencies between these prior predictions, or add in dependencies between the latent estimates of the world. You could parameterize both. Maybe you only want to parameterize one or the other, but these interneurons are what are giving you those dependencies that really make your estimates more expressive. It's just another normalizing flow there. So I think there's a lot to look at in terms of comparing normalizing flows and these normalizing computations with these types of lateral inhibitory interactions that are going on. So just to summarize the correspondence section of this, I think by traversing this bridge, you get some really interesting correspondences that come out. One being deep networks and pyramidal neurons. So I'm certainly not the first to suggest that there's a correspondence here. There's papers going back to simulations from the early 90s that are suggesting this. But I think it's only fairly recently that people have been starting to realize that maybe this linear threshold unit model from deep learning is not an accurate representation of neuronal computation. So I think there's a lot to explore here. And then also this correspondence now between normalizing flows and lateral inhibition, which there have been many works looking at trying to describe lateral inhibition in terms of a normalization procedure. But typically they're restricting themselves to this linear normalization procedure, whereas normalizing flows provides a strict generalization of that procedure. It has all of these nice tie-ins with probabilistic modeling and things like that. So I think there's a lot more to look at there. So I'm really excited for what that brings. So what I see in terms of trying to do these correspondences is that we can move beyond our current comparisons between deep networks and neuroscience. So currently, most of the efforts in trying to link up deep learning with neuroscience just revolve around supervised learning. And it's really in this paradigm of brief visual presentations of images. So it's you flash an image, you just get the bottom-up procedure or the bottom-up pass of neural activity, and then you try to link that up with what we have from training things like AlexNet and VGG and these types of networks. So there's been a lot of interesting work there, but I think that there's a real limitation of these works, which is that they're totally ignoring the effects of feedback. At least many of them are, and they're ignoring the dynamics for the most part. So Cortex has to deal with this evolving world where you're trying to use information from the past, use higher level abstract information to try to predict what's going to happen in the future, what's happening right now. And I think that these current efforts to compare deep networks in the brain are just totally missing that. So I think there's a lot left to do in terms of trying to link up more of these generative styles of models with the brain. And I think VAEs really do provide potentially one way of testing some of these ideas from predictive coding, where a lot of the models in predictive coding currently are just limited in terms of the types of data that they're using and the sizes of models that they're training. So there has been some early works in trying to line up VAEs and recordings from the brain. So this is a paper from Bill Lauder and colleagues from 2018, where they look at trying to take some findings from neuroscience and link them up now with their model called PREDNet, which is a type of VAE. But I think there's a lot of work left to be done in taking some of these, it's only within the past year that people have really trained up these large-scale models on large-scale images with some impressive results. And I think as we move increasingly toward video, and as well as this kind of interactive setting, I think is going to be a lot of interesting work in trying to line up some of the dynamics that we see in these models with what we're finding from neuroscience. And just as kind of a final note, all of this talk was just about sensory processing. But you might be thinking, well, actually, a lot of the brain is actually devoted to motor control. So you have entire prefrontal cortex and motor cortex, which is involved in this executive actions that you're taking, as well as a cerebellum, which is involved in kind of correcting these motor errors that you have. So I don't want to make the impression that predictive coding only applies to vision and only applies to sensory processing, because a lot of the same computational techniques can just be readily applied to control and reinforcement learning. So in this case, instead of having this kind of sensory prediction errors, you have now these motor prediction errors, which are driving your updates to your motor neurons. And so you have this nice feedback control type of procedure that comes out. So if you're interested in seeing what that looks like, I applied iterative amortization now to the policy optimization setting and reinforcement learning. So if you're interested, definitely check out this paper. And I think there's a lot left to do on that end as well. And it's a very exciting time. And so with that, I'd like to thank all of you for listening to my talk. And I'd be happy to take questions if anyone has them.
All right, thank you so much, Joseph. That was really fascinating. Yeah, so all of you, if you have questions, you can either directly speak up, or you can also type your question into the chat, and I'm happy to read it for you. I think Emre has a question. Maybe you just unmute yourself and ask it.
Yep. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Oh, okay, great. Thanks, Joe. That was a really great talk. So I had a question, actually, / comment for part where you mentioned about neurons as being backpropagation within the neurons. And if you think of an LSTM, that's kind of what it is, right? It's basically a neuron that has more components than just that linear threshold part.
Yeah.
And in that sense, there's backpropagation within the neuron. And in fact, that's, if you look at some of Schmidt-Huber's early papers, he's not backpropagating beyond that single unit. It's only doing backpropagation within the unit. So I was wondering what your thoughts were on that.
Yeah, I think I'm still trying to figure out. So I should say that back in this work by Bill Lauder, so their modules are using LSTMs. And so you could think of these modules as being something closer to an LSTM, where maybe you have a memory within the neuron that's getting written, and you have backpropagation through that whole module. So I think it's not unheard of, but it's really unclear, because you could also think of having recurrent networks of neurons as well. It's not clear exactly where to draw that correspondence.
Right. We have another question from Raj. Please.
Hi, Joe. Yeah, great work. So speaking as the Rao and Ballard, I think you definitely did a great job of putting out the motivation starting from the Mumford work, which was definitely inspirational for me as a graduate student reading that paper. And also, I think the connection that you made to Helmholtz machine. So that was already something that we had known about. I think one interesting connection, so you made this connection between the iterative optimization versus amortized inference. And on the same time that we were thinking about predictive coding as a model for Cortex, Bruno Olshausen and David Field were also thinking about learning, the receptive fields of Cortex, of visual cortex. And so they came up with the sparse coding model, which is also really well known, in machine learning. And that particular model, it's iterative, right? And the way that they did it, the reason why they did it that way is because they can add that constraint, right? The L1 constraint on the latent variables. So I think people have attempted to do that with VAEs, but with VAEs, you tend to see not the same kind of, learned sort of compositional representations, right? In terms of Gabor filters or the kinds of things you see with sparse coding. So I'm wondering are there kind of trade-offs there in terms of doing amortized inference and the kind of things you learn versus like the localized receptive fields versus the iterative one where you can add additional constraints and start to learn. So from a learning point of view, right, representation learning point of view, are there trade-offs there?
So I think that there shouldn't be, in theory, like you should be able to learn whatever representation you need for, if you have this deep network parameterization. But, and I think this is something that is totally underexplored, is that the inference procedure does actually change what type of representation you learn quite a bit. So just anecdotally, when you train these VAEs with iterative inference rather than this direct procedure, so for one, you're able to traverse the optimization landscape, and so you can really explore a lot of different kind of like bistable perceptual estimates, where it could be a face, could be a vase kind of thing, and you're really able to encode a lot more information into those latent variables in terms of the KL divergence with the prior than you would with this direct encoding procedure where you're kind of limiting the types of things that you can infer. I think there is definitely some trade-off there, but I haven't seen any works that have explored that systematically.
Right. Could be another paper for you in archive, right? Coming up soon. But yeah, great work. Yeah, looking forward to reading also the latest one on control and RL. Sounds very interesting. Thanks.
Any more questions? Please type in your questions into the chat. If not, I have a question in the meantime. So how do you see the future of hierarchical variational autoencoders, and what do we have to do in order to make them sort of more useful, or to make them learn truly useful, more abstract representations of the data?
Yeah, no, that's an excellent question, and I feel very strongly that these hierarchical models, especially now across time, that's going to be the future of all video compression and everything that we do with media. So but I think that there's still a lot left to work out in terms of, as you know, and we discussed learning dynamics in these models, because you do find that it's not always, there are these kind of local minima issues where if you're trying to learn the dynamics and the representation at the same time, it can be challenging to learn both, and so you end up just with a worse model. So there's still some training issues that are left to be worked out, as well as just memory issues. If you try to train these models at large scale, you really can't do it unless you're at a huge company. So I'm not sure exactly if it would just wait out until GPUs get much better, but yeah, I think there's some architectural and computational hurdles still left to overcome there as well.
Right. Lots of questions still. I think next one might be Preston, perhaps, and then Roy and Gidris, if we have time.
All right. Hi, Joe. Great talk. I want to ask your opinions on kind of making multimodal predictions. So like one thing we know that limits the expressivity of VAEs is that typically we assume pretty simple posterior, and obviously like humans or other animals, they are able to make like multimodal predictions, and then that guides their behavior and planning and all the functions they can do in kind of control and RL. I wonder, do you think many of the kind of new directions you talked about today, such as flow models and maybe even energy-based models, how do you see them, or do you see them in helping with the multimodal prediction problem?
Yeah, so definitely normalizing flows is a great general purpose technique for multimodal predictions, and you do find that you get better performance out of those. But what I've also realized, going back to kind of what we discussed with Rajesh Rao, like having this type of iterative optimization procedure also gives you the ability to have multimodal predictions, in the sense that you can sample for multiple modes, even though your estimate at any particular iteration is just a unimodal distribution. So there's a nice paper from Klaus Greff where they took this idea of iterative amortization and applied it to these object models, and they showed that you can now, you do have this multi-stability effect where you can have different modes of interpretation of the object composition of a scene. And likewise, in reinforcement learning, I've seen that having this iterative optimization ability allows you to explore multiple modes of the value landscape for taking an action. So it's kind of like you're able to really direct your exploration toward regions of the optimization surface much better. So I see it as normalizing flows are definitely a useful component, but also just moving beyond this direct encoding scheme is also hugely important as well.
All right, Roy is next.
Hi, Joe. Great talk. Thank you. I was wondering what your thoughts are on this amortization gap that you talked about. Does amortization always hurt performance? I'm not sure if that's what you were trying to claim. Sort of seems to fly against this concept of more expressive models that truly can't generalize without amortizing.
Yeah, so amortization, it's kind of a weird thing because so amortization might help you in the sense of maybe breaking out of local minima and certainly is way more efficient for training these models. But there is this issue of, I think any optimizer is not going to give you perfectly optimal estimates. And so it seems like you can always improve your estimate a little bit. It's not clear how much that actually impacts the model. But you can quantify the difference in performance. And so there were a couple of papers in 2018, in addition to mine, where they looked at the amortization gap, and they did see that there is some actual gap in performance as a result. But yeah, it's another one of those things where it hasn't been systematically studied as well as one might hope, because it's really truly a form of meta optimization, and it hasn't really been explored like qualitatively, what types of solutions do you get out of this rather than gradient-based inference or optimization?
All right, and then the last question perhaps for today would be Gidris. Do you want to ask your question yourself?
Sure, yes. Hey Joe, great talk. I have a question about free energy. So free energy, it was Friston who introduced this essentially idea that coding can be generalized with free energy. I just wanted your thoughts on how this shows up in the VAE framework versus predictive coding.
Yeah, so free energy is this variational objective, which is just the negative of the elbow, which is this evidence lower bound, which appears in VAEs. So even though people like to use the term free energy, you just think of it as it's the negative of the elbow, which is what we use. So there's that exact relationship. But there are a lot of connections and ideas that Friston has proposed in terms of things like generalized coordinates. He's looked at papers. He's had papers with like Boltzmann posteriors instead of Gaussian posteriors, and then he has this whole line of work on active inference, which I think is only sort of kind of making it into machine learning now. So there's a lot of Friston's ideas are still out there and waiting to be incorporated into machine learning.
Right. So essentially, he saw this connection between predictive coding and VAE, but so Raj's predictive coding framework is more in time, right? It's prediction of the next state of its next time step, while in his approach, it's more probabilistic kind of notion.
Not necessarily. So Raj's paper is more exploring the hierarchical form of this, although he had some follow-up kind of review papers where you can also look at the sequential form of this, which ends up looking very similar to this normalizing flow kind of prediction process. So they're both hierarchical. The only difference really, if you boil it down, is that Friston's saying you can generalize this to having a distribution for your latent estimate, whereas in Raj's paper, they're just doing a point estimate for the estimate, for that latent estimate. So variational inference just gives you a generalization of the inference procedure, but it's the same type of model, really.
All right, thanks.
All right.
Yeah,
thank
just
you
to add to that, I mean, I think we were also inspired by the common filter analogy there, right? So in the common filter, it is a Gaussian model. And I guess basically some people thought we were just doing a hierarchical version of a common filter, right? So if you had done all the covariance updates, up the hierarchy, which some people had done purely without any time involved, then you could basically get a fully Gaussian kind of model up the chain, both temporally and up the hierarchy, right? But it'll all be, this linear Gaussian models. But yeah, and yeah, you're right. Friston kind of generalized that to make the connection to the variational side of things also. So yeah. Cool, thanks.
Thank you.
All right, I think time is up. Thank you very much, Joe, for a fascinating talk. And you saw there was a lot of interest, lots of questions. So with that, let's close the session. Thanks again, and see you all soon.
Cool. Thank you.